and good afternoon to everyone. We are about to start in 1 or 2 minutes. Let's just give everyone time to join. And in the meanwhile, let me tell you that we have announced the dates for our lovely SmartCon, which is happening late September. So I will encourage you to visit our website, smartcon.chain.link, because you can attend either virtually or you can join us in New York. So we hope to see you all there. Let's wait for one. So before we start, a couple of things for housekeeping. First, you have a tab for Q&A. Please feel free to write your questions down. We will try to address them either while we speak, or if you are not confident or comfortable to write your questions now, you can hold them to the end, and then we will take some time at the end to answer those questions. My name is Victor Estival. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Proof of Reserve here at Chainlink. And with me today, I have Max Melcher and Bryan Jowers. So I let them introduce themselves. Max?
Hey, my name is Max Melcher. I'm the go-to-market lead for Proof of Reserve here at Chainlink Labs, and great to be here today.
Excited to check Proof of Reserves with you, Victor. I'm Bryan. I'm on the product side, and I work on Proof of Reserves.
So today, the first thing we're going to do is to clarify a little bit more what is Proof of Reserve and what is Proof of Reserve for. And then I will be asking a couple of questions to our folks here. So let's go ahead and kick it off. So next slide. So we are talking about Proof of Reserves. The first thing we need to do is to define what are reserves. So the term reserves can vary a little bit, whether we are talking about banking or we are talking about business in general. So for banking, the term reserves refers for money that we put aside for, what may happen for day-to-day operations. When it comes into the more business side, this term refers to the money in hand, so what kind of money we have for, any kind of future payments, unexpected events, and so on and so forth. So now that we know what reserves are, the next thing is, okay, but how do we know what kind of reserves do we have? And more important, how can we prove that we have these reserves? So in the next slide, you can see that today we're doing some kind of attestation of these reserves. How do we do this today? What is the traditional way? Well, that kind of checking, it tends to be manual. It's usually centralized. It's also expensive. And because all these reasons, it doesn't get regular updates. With Proof of Reserve, this checking can be automatic, can be fully decentralized, therefore inexpensive, and we will cover this in a minute. It can even be near to real time. So because all of these advantages, you can see the value of using Proof of Reserve to just check what kind of reserves do I have back in my assets in this way. So what is Proof of Reserve? When we go to the next slide, you'll see our definition of Proof of Reserve. Proof of Reserve get definite on-chain proof of any assets through collateralization. And when we mean on-chain, that means that, the Oracle problem, we will be able to get information for either other chains or even from off-chain and bring it in on-chain. So this enable reliable and timely monitoring of reserve assets using automated audits based on cryptographic tools. What are the main benefits then of POR? In the next slide, we will see that we basically highlight 3 main benefits. The first one is that we will reduce insolvency risk with automatic threat-based audits. We will also improve transparency for users, and we can even prevent systemic failures in DeFi. In the next slide, we will cover what kind of users do we have. We have multiple users, but we want to highlight 4 of them because of the size and they're very interesting use case. If we have time at the end, we can go deeper into these use cases. We have Paxos, we have Gemini, we have BitGo, and Trust Token. For those that you might not be very familiar with them, BitGo are the guys behind Wrap BTC, and Trust Token, they are backing or they are creating the stablecoin TUSD. Now, let's get into the questions with Max and Bryan. So the first question, this is for Max, is, Max, what do you think Chainlink Proof of Reserve is becoming more and more important these days in this space?
Absolutely. So I think the impetus for Proof of Reserve lately is a consequence of failures in this space. And so my parents don't know when an airdrop occurs or when Chainlink Keepers and VRF launched on Phantom, but they do know when there's been a multi-million-dollar exploit in crypto because it's the prevailing headline that reaches a large portion of the world. And lately, bridges and wrapped assets have been a large culprit. So I think a multi-chain future is going to bring tremendous utility in the forms of like application-specific blockchains, higher throughput blockchains, but they also carry significant risks. And I think, this year alone, over $1 billion in exploits. If we want this ecosystem to be safe and secure and onboard the next 100 million users, we need more emphasis on these additional layers of security. And that's exactly what Chainlink Proof of Reserve is. So, while it's unfortunate that we're getting all this emphasis on Proof of Reserve now that it's been exploits, I really think the importance in this space to securely enable growth over the coming years comes through something like Chainlink Proof of Reserve, where you have a completely independent set of validators, and it's just an additional check, a separation of interests to ensure the collateralization of these assets in DeFi.
You're absolutely right. We can read about hacks almost every other month, which is really, really unfortunate. Okay, let's go to the next question. The next one is for Bryan. So what kind of assets can Chainlink Proof of Reserve verify? Do you have like a very short list, or is this a very broad list? What is the answer, Bryan?
When I think about proof of reserves, I ask a really simple question. Can we verify asset holdings for a collection or an entity? If that valid test passes, then I think proof of reserves is a good candidate to pursue. I think about this space by segmenting it into how we source the data. So on and off chain is a natural way to segment. Digital assets such as tokens, NFTs, those are things that can be sourced on chain. So native tokens, wrapped tokens, these are things that we can look on chain at any time, ad hoc, real time, to pull proof of reserves. I think this is a natural case that should exist. It should become standard. It should be something that we've been doing for a decade or so in our industry. But I think we're playing catch up now to Max's point. On the off-chain piece, these are things that are a little less typical for us in our space. These are off-chain, offline assets that we can gain attestation and report onto the blockchain. So these are tokenized off-chain assets, just physical golds or real life offline synthetics. Another natural obvious one is fiat-backed stablecoins. So do you have the cash or the asset that backs the stablecoin? Yes or no, in a really transparent, open manner. And that's really the beauty of proof of reserves here.
We can see this kind of FUDs going back and forward almost every day. So one of the things I was very surprised when I joined Chainlink and when I learned about Proof of Reserve was this real-time thing. So I think the next question is, can these checks really be made in real time, or at least close to real time? Because that's one of the major concerns when we talk to some projects, right? Like, okay, but how long does it take since I do the update? How many days, how many weeks, how many hours? So can we really sort this time out, Bryan?
In short, Victor, yes. It all comes down to the availability of the data source. So I talked previously about, I think about it how we segment it based on how we source the data. So if the proof of reserve data can be found on chain, then that data is typically highly available and becomes available real time. We update, make it available, and publish the same way that we do our price feeds today. If the proof of reserve data is found off-chain, then the data is as real time as the attestation that we can fetch. So an example here is the data is as valid as the gold bars being counted and digitally documented, but everything that we do prints our knowledge in real time. So I would say yes, absolutely.
That's great. That was one of my major concerns when I was learning about this technology. It was like, I love this, but I want to know how quick we can make these things real. So basically, what we cover is that proof of reserve analyze your reserves, and therefore will provide some transparency, right? So if we go to the next slide, we will cover the question that really it's bothering me. And sometimes it's like, okay, but all this transparency, all this security, really, how all those things improve any projects? And I think this is a question for Max, because that's one of the questions we get more often from different projects that we talk about, right? Like, okay, but what's in for me? Like, how can I improve my project if I bring you in, right? So Max?
Absolutely, Victor. I think when we're talking about improving a project's security and transparency, there's really two parties we look at. There's the asset issuers, these are the people tokenizing, and then there's the DeFi protocols. And maybe to back up a little bit, Chainlink's been working with the top DeFi protocols for the last 2 to 3 years. These are your money markets, derivatives, synthetics. And what has consistently come up in our conversations with them is how they do their risk assessments. Many of these protocols have shared pools, essentially. So if one asset gets compromised, it has the ability to affect the entire protocol. So risk assessment is a continuous operation for these protocols. And they've asked Chainlink, what ways can we mitigate risk? And that's really what proof of reserve can do. It can mitigate risk. One of the things I love about DeFi is it's a free market, right? So if you have two assets of equal value, if you're an asset issuer, there's two assets of equal value, but one asset has a fee that at all times shows it's backed 1-to-1. For any DeFi protocol looking to accept that asset to their platform and choose between the two, it's very simple for them to do that risk analysis and decide. So I think on one layer you have, as an issuer, security in the sense that you can prove as you mint that you have what you say you have. I think for individuals who hold any tokenized asset to know that at all times their $1 token is backed by an actual dollar in a bank. And then for the DeFi protocols who provide the utility for these tokens to know, hey, this asset is not a risk to list in my platform. I'm going to be secure listing this asset. And at the end of the day, these protocols, they want to list more assets. They want more utility for their platforms, but mitigating the risk is a top priority for them. And Chainlink Proof of Reserve addresses that.
That is great. So to summarize, what will you say are some of the major benefits that you would get out of proof of reserve, Max?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time because data availability. We've progressed to the point where a lot of this data is available today, and the idea that we can get it on chain and prove at all times is not that far out of reach. And I think the main benefit here is that as we onboard again to that next 100 million users, we don't want them to be going through those same hacks and exploits. It's only going to set the adoption of the space back. So one of the main benefits is really an unseen benefit, which is the security it provides to all the users in the ecosystem, all the protocols, and really can fast track adoption of this space.
This is really cool.
I think Bryan, I could add to that. I mean, I look at proof of reserves as a critical component to the crypto, blockchain, DeFi, everything space maturing, moving past, FUD distraction, and being able to deliver a trustworthy product to all customers worldwide. Without proof of reserve, there's a lot of distraction and there's a lot of hesitance from all spectrums of users. So I'd like to see the space mature, and for us to get to a point where Proof of reserve is a standard. It is an expected component to our financial infrastructure in a distributed space. Until that happens, there's going to be a fractured level of truth across the blockchain space, in my opinion.
That's great. So for the audience, I got here a bunch of Q&A, but feel free to write some more if you want, because we have a lot of time. The first one I think is for Bryan. So the first one says, could you please explain a little bit more about the technology that is powering Proof of Reserve?
Oh, such a broad question. Happy to. I'd say Proof of Reserve leverages the core and the best parts of the Chainlink distributed network. Our DAWNs, which power such a majority part of the DeFi space, provide the same level of technology and resilience and redundancy for Proof of Reserve. So let's take a use case for on-chain. On-chain, we might have 30 plus nodes, independent Chainlink operators that are querying a list of addresses from smart contract and are able to calculate, here are the total number of assets, what are their tokens, whatever they might be, come to a distributed consensus that is fault proof and be able to report that back onto the chain. So as you, a developer, consumes our price feeds today, you can consume a feed of a Proof of Reserve with just as much ease and frictionless experience as you have today with feeds.
That's super interesting. The next one is for Max. So the question says, Max, you mentioned before something about minting. Can you please elaborate a bit more about this minting functionality that you talk about, please?
Yeah. So one of the parts of the process in terms of onboarding digital assets is the creation of digital assets on chain. It's commonly referred to as minting. And this is a process which is handled a number of different ways, sometimes in a black box even. But essentially, the creation of new assets, especially tokenized assets, are always assumed to be backed by something. And traditionally, this assumption was just that, an assumption. And one of the use cases of Proof of Reserve is to actually transparently show in the minting process that you are only minting what you have reserves of. So I think a great example of this, and someone we work with closely on this, is the project Cash Gold. So they're doing tokenized gold. And one of the cool things about them is they've got 4 vaults across 3 continents. All of these vaults have essentially little scanning mechanisms. So when new gold bars enter the vaults, it automatically updates the reserve system. And Chainlink pulls that down and updates that reserve value on chain. Now, whenever Cash Gold goes to mint new tokenized gold, that minting process references the Proof of Reserve feed to transparently show their users to DeFi that they can only mint what they have in reserves, which I think is really the final scenario of what we're aiming for with Proof of Reserve, which is that transparent process end to end of asset issuance on chain. I think also, people always ask me like, what's the practical use of blockchain today? Or, what's the actual application? I think this is a great application of someone doing it, to Bryan's point, in the standard way we'd like to see into the future.
To expand on that, I think what's even more interesting, because I think the minting use case is so obvious, but it goes beyond just like traditional mint. We live in a multi-chain world. Assets are moving across blockchains. We're going to see this continue to grow. So you have a centralized total number of assets that can be minted, but as you move them, and if they're not necessarily wrapped, if they're if they're true native representations on different blockchains, then being able to quickly look at all of those assets across multiple chains and ensure that your total capitalization for that collection of tokens is truly at its expected max mint, I think is super important for the both maturity and the consistency of the network.
Indeed. The next question, I really like it because it's super polite. So greetings everyone. I wish you plenty of health and good fortune. So is there any minimum size of the reserve to make it worthwhile? So Could we have, I don't know, a small amount to be checked? Do we have any hard limit here, or is on project basis? Maybe we can have a conversation and talk about that. That's for Max.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's no minimum, just to be clear. I think it really depends on the project, the asset issuer. One of the cool things about being an open source protocol is that anybody can set up a Chainlink node, anybody can run a Chainlink node, and really it's up to the project. As you scale, transparency may become more important. I think what we've seen is that initially, early on in the construction of any tokenized asset is the best time to get involved with proof of reserve. We can always upgrade and put proof of reserve logic in later on, but showing transparently from the start your reserves as you issue, I think will just give DeFi more security in your asset. And I think really starting with the standard is the way to go. So no minimum in terms of reserves. It's really dependent on the project. I don't know, Bryan, if you have anything to add to that.
I completely agree. I don't have one off the top of my head, but I could imagine, verifying that there's one and only one of something has a use case to it. So I think it's really use case dependent. So no, definitely open to all these different use cases.
So the next one, I think it's for Bryan. How many node signatures would be needed, or would be the consensus mechanisms for POR? I think the question is about how many nodes do we have at minimum for POR?
It's really configurable. We can raise and lower that threshold specifically based on, say, the value that's being secured. But it's very typical for us to see in the high teens, in the 20s and 30s are pretty typical numbers of nodes that we look for consensus. But again, if you're looking for something that's not securing any value and it's a different use case, maybe you don't need that level of redundancy. So it's all use case based. Max, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's spot on. Again, it's up to the project. If someone wants to secure one, Picasso painting, I'd be very interested to see that. And I think that probably ties us into real world assets. I see there's a question from AG regarding how can POR feeds for real world assets be decentralized, or is the point of failure always the real world asset data source? I think that's a tremendous question. And I think just to kick it off, I think that's the cool part about the Chainlink network, specifically Dawn's, is you look at our price feeds, for example, and it's not just one data source that they pull in to come to consensus on price. It's multiple, and it's really meant to scale up to as many as are available and deemed high quality. So just like our price feeds take in multiple sources of data, Chainlink Proof of Reserve can work with multiple sources of data for reserve data. If there are multiple auditors, if there's access to the bank accounts, if it's something with satellites and there's multiple satellites, it scales with the data sources available to us, which I think is the cool part about that.
I think that's important to highlight. One of the key pieces of Chainlink's redundancy is our obsession about being able to source multiple fault-proof sources of data. And so I think the off-chain space is more nascent than what we see with on-chain, but I think you'll see us continue to strive to make that data source as reliable as possible. Max highlights, multiple auditors, independent data sources, I think are really key.
So here we have another question. I think this is for Bryan. In Keepers, we can visualize where Keeper runs on keepers.chain.link. How can we visualize the data from Proof of Reserve?
Interesting point. All of the Proof of Reserve data is written on chain, so you'd be able to use that data. We haven't spent our time yet making really pretty dashboards of the assets that we're tracking for Proof of Reserve. However, all of our feeds that are public can be found on data.market.link and also on chain. I think, as we continue to build out this product, if we see a need to be able to do that, we're going to be investing and building towards that goal.
Also in docs, right? You can also find the contracts in the docs, if I recall correctly.
Absolutely. So you'd be able to find the contract addresses in our docs. They're correct.
Very well. Then we have another question that is really interesting about how can users use proof of reserve without compromising the competitive advantages of road mapping. I think this relates to the transparency we have in proof of reserve or across the whole Chainlink portfolio. So basically, to answer this question, I think what we have on chain is all transparent, and whatever we are proving with proof of reserve, as Bryan just mentioned, you can just visualize that on the contracts or on data.chain.link. So I don't know if you have anything to add here, Max.
No, I think, actually, I believe that having proof of reserve is a competitive advantage for projects. Actually, I think when you look across different assets and you're looking for a way to differentiate, someone that's transparently showing their reserves at all time, to me, is a significant differentiator, and actually, gives an advantage for that asset's utility across DeFi. Protocols are more willing to accept it because of that transparency. And especially, like I was saying earlier, when the value is the same for two assets, it's really what else can you do to prove that you are a more secure asset to enable utility across DeFi.
We're going to see more and more of the ecosystem demanding such transparency and value into the system. So we're creating a standard. We didn't invent proof of reserve, but we sure are bringing it in the most user-friendly way, we believe, to the ecosystem, whether you're using Chainlink. However you're achieving proof of reserve, I think it's a standard that users are going to be demanding. And as our ecosystem matures, you're going to see value migrate to projects that prioritize this kind of table stakes, in my opinion.
Right. I think this question is related to what you just answered, Bryan. So the question is, in which blockchains is proof of reserve available today?
Excited to answer this question. The proof of reserve team, the proof of reserve engineering team, has expanded the Chainlink reach. So we're available on every blockchain that we're natively integrated and provide, keepers, VRF, price feed products today. But we go beyond that. You don't necessarily need smart contract native, capabilities on a blockchain to be able to pull and do proof of reserve. So we do proof of reserve on Bitcoin today. And we do proof of reserve for Dogecoin today. And this is specifically for on-chain. So as you have new use cases and networks, bring them to us. We'll talk with you. And if we have that gap, we'll be excited to close it. We want to be able to provide proof of reserve as a service across the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think
the next question, sorry.
To chime into that, I think one of the cool parts about this too is that a lot of these blockchains, they may not have had smart contracts, and they want to bridge assets over. So if I was holding, let's say Bitcoin, for example, I previously couldn't participate in DeFi. Other blockchains like, Filecoin as well. We do wrap Filecoin with Gemini. All these users, they have these assets, they believe in these assets, but they're limited by the blockchain they're on. And so securely moving these assets cross-chain really opens them up to more of the DeFi opportunities that exist to users with assets on that chain. So I think that's really one of the cool parts about maybe holding one of those assets, but securely feeling like you can move it cross-chain and participate in the DeFi community that's always growing.
It's truly cross-chain liquidity. And for eager protocols and developers, that should be really exciting. Unlocking capital across the ecosystem that's not natively unlocked is pretty thrilling to think about.
The next one is for Max. We have a lot of questions. That's great. So you're welcome to ask a few more if you want. So the next one is for Max. So you mentioned with Cache Gold that someone else is looking after the reserves. Are all the tokens third-party audited or not?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the cool parts about their specific setup is you have asset issuers and you also have custodians. So the asset issuer is not the same person who is holding all the tokens. They've actually got vaults in their case, which hold the tokens. And so these vaults, like Brinks is one of them, they monitor and scan the gold bars as they come in. It's not Cash Gold that we're getting the data from. It's a third-party auditor called Gram Chain that is essentially monitoring all of those gold bars coming in and out of the vaults. And they're the ones with the data that we update on chain. So even if Cash Gold wanted to say, give themselves 1 million, it's out of their control because the data doesn't come from them.
Okay, interesting. This one, I think it's for Bryan. So I heard that Chainlink is hiring, but what is the skill set that you need to work in a product like Proof of Reserve or the products you usually manage?
I would say my number one thing that I look for is passion of the ecosystem, believing in a vision that not only what Chainlink is going to be able to deliver, but our ecosystem is going to deliver to the world. Beyond that, I would say reach out, talk to us, and get to know the different roles. Every role is going to be different. I think the level of experience in the blockchain space is often overinflated than in reality. So definitely reach out. We'd love to chat.
Great. So we don't have more questions right now. Let's give the people a couple of minutes to ask more questions. In the meanwhile, just a bit of housekeeping. We will put a link to Typeform. We really encourage you to fill this form. This is the best way we have to improve. You can provide us with not only your feedback or how well the speakers, Max or Bryan, did today, but also more ideas for what do you want to see in the next upcoming Tech Talks. Because that's a very good way for us to find new topics to keep you excited and to, do more sessions like this. Ask Me Anything. It's not always easy to get people like Max or Bryan here. I'm really, really excited. We had a lot of questions today. This is great. Please don't forget to fill the Typeform and remember about the SmartCon. As I said before, we already have dates live, 28, 29 September in New York. If you want to attend virtual, it's going to be free. Hopefully, Mr. Max Melcher and Bryan will be there too. So thanks a lot. And if you have questions, feel free to reach us. Thank you very much. Bye.